In the chaos of World War II, the Allies unleashed a fighter so tough it was nicknamed the Jug, a machine that brought pilots home riddled with holes and left enemies shaking. By now, everyone recognizes the P-47 Thunderbolt as America's unstoppable warbird, but almost no one knows its creator. Not an American, but Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian exile who fled Bolshevik terror, survived as a Paris trapeze artist, and reinvented aviation in the labs of New York. How did a refugee from war-torn Tbilisi outthink the world's top engineers to build the fighter that changed the course of history? To answer that, you have to start before the Thunderbolt, on the night Kartveli escaped for his life. In 1919, Tbilisi was a city on the edge. The Red Army was pushing hard into Georgia, and for families like the Kartvelishvilis, the world they knew was crumbling fast. Alexander was born into a noble household, his father a respected figure, their family name carrying weight for centuries. But the Bolsheviks had no use for old titles or tradition. With every day, the rumours grew darker. Arrests, disappearances, homes confiscated by the new regime. For Alexander, the decision came down to survival. He and his mother gathered what little they could carry and left behind the city, the house and the graves of family members they would never see again. Their route out was as desperate as it was dangerous. The Black Sea offered one of the few escape corridors left. Smugglers and refugees packed the docks, all hoping to outrun the Red Army's advance. The journey was more gamble than plan. No guarantees, no safe passage, just a hope that the next port would be Paris and not a prison camp. For a young man raised with the certainty of privilege, the reality of exile hit hard. The family's wealth was gone, stripped away by revolution. Their only currency was a handful of documents and the thin protection of a mother's arms. On the ship, Alexander watched the Georgian coastline fade into the haze, knowing he might never return. The future was a blank slate, and the only thing left from his old life was a stubborn refusal to give up. Paris was not a land of promise, just the next place to survive. But something in that crossing, leaving behind everything except family, would shape every decision he made from then on. For Kartveli, escape wasn't just about running from danger. It was about carrying the memory of loss forward and finding a way to turn exile into purpose. Paris in the early 1920s was a city bursting with invention. But for a young exile with no fortune and no French to speak of, it was also a test of survival. Alexander Kartveli's first jobs in the city were about as far from the world of aviation as you could imagine. Some stories, repeated in family circles and the occasional magazine, claim he kept himself afloat as a circus trapeze artist, risking broken bones for a few francs. Whether or not that's true, what's certain is that he supported himself by teaching mathematics and taking any work he could find, all while enrolled at the École supérieure d'aéronautique. The classroom was only half the battle. Paris's aviation scene was a fierce meritocracy, and jobs at the big firms went to those who could prove themselves under pressure. Kartveli landed a position at Blériot, one of France's pioneering aircraft companies. There, he found himself surrounded by engineers and test pilots who had survived the war and were hungry to break new records. For a time, Kartveli even joined them in the cockpit, flying his own designs to test their limits. That ended abruptly when a crash left him with a broken neck and several damaged vertebrae. The injury forced him out of the pilot's seat for good, but it also gave him a kind of clarity. If he couldn't fly, he would pour everything into design. His technical skill didn't go unnoticed. By the mid-1920s, he was credited with contributions to advanced aircraft at Blériot and the Bernard Company, including a model that flirted with world speed records, though the official record books list others as chief designers. Still, Kartveli's reputation grew. In a city packed with talent, he stood out for his relentless drive and willingness to start over after every setback. Paris had given him scars and a new name, but it had also forged an engineer who knew how to survive. The next challenge would require all of that resilience and a leap across the Atlantic. In 1927, the Atlantic crossing wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a leap into the unknown. Alexander Kartveli stepped off the ship in New York with little more than a battered suitcase and a portfolio of technical sketches. The only reason he was allowed in at all was a rare immigration waiver, arranged by Charles Levine, the American financier who'd made headlines bankrolling the first transatlantic passenger flight. Levine saw something in Kartveli's work that others missed, a kind of stubborn brilliance that wouldn't quit, even when the odds were stacked sky high. The American aviation industry, at that moment, was a clubby, insular world, dominated by homegrown talent and old money. Kartveli didn't fit the mould. He spoke English with a thick accent, dressed like a Parisian engineer, and had a habit of sketching fuselage cross-sections on napkins during lunch. But talent has a way of cutting through barriers. Within months, he landed a job at Seversky Aircraft, a new company founded by another Tbilisi-born émigré, Alexander de Seversky. The two men, one a war-scarred pilot turned entrepreneur, the other a designer forged by exile and injury, found common ground in their outsider status. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and a shared belief that survival depended on innovation. Kartveli's rise through the ranks was as rapid as it was unlikely. By the early 1930s, he held the title of chief engineer, responsible for turning blueprints into flying machines. His first major American project, the Seversky P-35, introduced ideas that would become his trademark: robust construction, advanced aerodynamics, and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. In boardrooms and hangars, Kartveli's word began to carry weight. He wasn't just another immigrant looking for a foothold. He was the engineer other engineers came to for answers. The collaboration with Seversky set the stage for a new chapter in American aviation. Where others saw technical limitations, Kartveli saw opportunities to build something stronger, faster, and more resilient. The trust he earned in these early years would prove essential, because the challenges ahead were about to get much bigger, and the stakes much higher. The Seversky P-35 was the first all-metal monoplane fighter to enter service with the US Army Air Corps. It looked like the future, sleek, with retractable landing gear and an enclosed cockpit, a far cry from the fabric biplanes it replaced. Kartveli's fingerprints were all over its design: tough structure, smooth lines, and a willingness to trade a little agility for strength and speed. In the late 1930s, that was enough to earn the P-35 a spot on the front line. But in the world of aviation, today's breakthrough is tomorrow's relic. The P-35's performance quickly fell behind as war clouds gathered in Europe and new enemy fighters pushed the limits of speed and firepower. Enter the Republic P-43 Lancer, Kartveli's next step. On paper, it was a leap forward: a turbo-supercharged engine, higher top speed, and a service ceiling that promised to keep up with the best. But the P-43 arrived just as the rules of air combat were changing. 4.50 caliber machine guns sounded impressive, until reports from Europe made it clear that anything less than 6 or even 8 wouldn't cut it. Worse, the Lancer lacked armor protection for the pilot and had no self-sealing fuel tanks. In a dogfight, those omissions weren't just technicalities. They were the difference between coming home and getting shot out of the sky. Test pilots and army evaluators didn't mince words. The P-43 was called out for its vulnerabilities: not enough firepower, no protection, and a fuel system that turned it into a flying tinderbox if hit. Its range was limited, and the turbo supercharger, meant to be its ace in the hole, proved unreliable and tricky to maintain. By the time it reached operational units, it was already obsolete, a stopgap at best and a liability at worst. The handful that saw action ended up as high-altitude photo recon planes, not fighters. For Kartveli, the lesson was brutal but clear: incremental improvements weren't going to win the next war. The Air Corps wanted a fighter that could outrun, outgun, and outlast anything in the sky. The shortcomings of the P-43 weren't just design flaws, they were warnings. The next aircraft would have to be something entirely new, built from the ground up to survive the realities of modern combat. The groundwork was set, but the real challenge was just beginning. Spring 1940, and the world was on fire. The US Army Air Corps sent out a memo that read, more like a dare than a request. Build a fighter that could hit 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Carry at least 6, preferably 8.50 caliber machine guns, and survive the kind of punishment pilots were seeing over Europe. Armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, range for hours, not minutes. If that sounded impossible, well, that was the point. The old rules of air combat were out. Everything the engineers thought they knew about what made a fighter fast, or agile, or even flyable was suddenly up for grabs. Alexander Kartveli got the news on a train somewhere between Washington and New York, clutching the specifications in his hand. The story goes that he pulled out his sketchbook right there, between the rattle of the tracks and the blur of passing fields, and started drawing something no one had ever seen before. The old XP-44 and XP-47 designs, lightweight, nimble, evolutionary, were dead on arrival. The only way to meet the new demands was to start over, and Kartveli didn't hesitate. He sketched a stretched fuselage to fit the biggest engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. He made room for a turbo supercharger system, so massive it needed its own ductwork running the length of the belly. 8 machine guns lined the wings, not because it looked good on paper, but because pilots were coming home saying 4 just wasn't enough. Every line on that sketch was a direct answer to the chaos pouring out of Europe. More speed, more altitude, more protection, more firepower, no compromise. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was existential. If American fighters couldn't survive the new battlefield, neither could their pilots. Kartveli's design, born on a moving train, would force the entire industry to rethink what a fighter could be. No one knew if it could even get off the ground, but the stakes were now measured in survival, not style points. Inside Republic Aviation, the arguments could get heated. Kartveli's design for the new fighter didn't just push the envelope, it shredded it completely. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, meant the P-47 could put more lead in the air than any Allied single-engine fighter before it. That's 3,400 rounds on board, enough to turn a head-on pass into a small-scale artillery barrage. But guns alone didn't make pilots feel safe. Kartveli demanded armor plate around the cockpit, heavy shielding for the engine, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could shrug off bursts from enemy cannon. Every pound added up, and the numbers started to look absurd. A maximum takeoff weight over 17,000 pounds, a bomb load of 2,500 pounds, and a fuselage big enough to house a turbo supercharger system the size of a small car. Not everyone was convinced. Some engineers called it a flying brick, and the Air Corps worried that all this protection would make the plane too sluggish to fight. The memos flew back and forth, weight versus maneuverability, firepower versus speed. But Kartveli wouldn't budge. He'd seen what happened to pilots in underprotected planes. His answer was blunt: weight is survival. If that meant the P-47 looked more like a brawler than a ballerina, so be it. The final blueprint was a direct challenge to the old dogmas: bigger, heavier, more powerful, and above all, designed to bring its pilot home. The pieces were in place. Now it was time to find out if this monster could actually fight. By the spring of 1943, the first P-47 Thunderbolts were rolling into combat squadrons across Europe. The pilots' first impressions weren't exactly glowing. Some called it a flying bathtub, others just grumbled about the weight. But those opinions didn't last long. The 56th Fighter Group, stationed at Halesworth, started sending back reports that read more like tall tales than after-action reviews. One pilot limped home with half his rudder shot away and a gaping hole where the right wingtip used to be. Another landed with the engine coughing, oil pouring from holes punched clean through the cowling, but the cockpit armour untouched. According to their squadron logs, a P-47 once took over 200 hits and still managed to bring its pilot back to base. Not exactly the fate you'd expect for something that size. The numbers back up the stories. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts rolled off the lines by war's end, more than any other American fighter. They racked up over 7,000 confirmed air-to-air kills, and that doesn't even count the tanks, trucks and trains they shredded on the ground. Pilots started calling it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or maybe just a nod to its squat barrel-chested look. Either way, it was a name said with respect. Luftwaffe aces could outturn it, but they couldn't put it down. Japanese pilots in the Pacific found the same thing. You could shoot at a Thunderbolt all day, and it would just keep coming. If you ask the men who flew it, they'll tell you the same thing. It wasn't the prettiest or the fastest, but when flak started flying or cannon shells tore through the wings, the Jug was the machine that took you home. That's not just luck or bravado, it's the result of every design choice Kartveli made, tested and proven over the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. Jet engines changed everything, but the core of Kartveli's design philosophy stayed stubbornly the same. The F-84 Thunderjet, rolled out in 1947, looked nothing like the burly, prop-driven Thunderbolt. Sleek, silver, and jet-powered, it was the first Republic design to break the sound barrier in a dive. Underneath the new skin, though, was the same obsession with survivability and raw power. The F-84 carried heavier loads than its rivals and could soak up damage that would have sent lighter jets spinning into the ground. By the time the Korean War heated up, squadrons of F-84s were flying deep penetration bombing missions over enemy territory, sometimes coming back with flak holes big enough to see daylight through the wings. Kartveli's next answer to the Cold War was the F-105 Thunderchief, a machine so fast and heavy it became known as the Thud. Designed to deliver nuclear weapons at supersonic speeds, the F-105 could fly low, fast and far, loaded with more ordnance than some World War II bombers. It was a technical marvel, but also a lightning rod for congressional scrutiny. Senate hearings in the late 1950s grilled Air Force officials about the program's soaring costs and complex engineering. One senator, flipping through a stack of blueprints, quipped, "Why does every Kartveli plane have to be bigger, faster, and heavier than the last?" The answer, buried in test reports and pilot logs, was always the same. These machines were built to survive, the engineer's version of insurance against a world that rarely played fair. From the prop-driven Jug to the supersonic Thud, Kartveli's fingerprints are everywhere in the story of American air power. His legacy is not just metal and engines, but a kind of stubborn optimism, a belief that even an outsider, exiled by history, could build something too tough to break. By the end of World War II, over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had rolled off American assembly lines, credited with more than 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. These numbers mark the legacy of Alexander Kartveli, whose journey began as a refugee from war-torn Georgia and led to the heart of US aviation. Archival records show Kartveli's focus on survivability, heavy armament, and performance changed frontline outcomes and influenced generations of aircraft, from the F-84 Thunderjet to the F-105 Thunderchief. While some early design debates and personal wartime correspondence remain sealed in government archives, the documented impact of Kartveli's work is clear. Today, historians and engineers still study the P-47 for lessons in innovation under pressure. The evidence shows that one immigrant's vision did not just shape a single fighter, it helped define American air power for decades to come.